committee. Any apologies for absence, Sam?
No apologies, Chair.
There is one sent to me personally from Paul Lloyd. He's having to take his wife to the hospital, but he will try and get in and attend later. Any item 2, disclosures of personal prejudicial interests from members?
Could I, Cyril, Chair, mention the fact that I am a member of the RSPB, and some might think that has relevance to the main item for discussion later. So just to mention, I am a member of the RSPB.
Okay, I think I got Deb, your legal. Would you have to place an interest form in?
Sorry, no, it's Scott here, but no, that's fine.
Oh,
I can
Scott.
mention.
It's okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
You're okay there.
Thank you.
Item 3, we're going to the minutes for accuracy. Page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, and page 5. Can I have a proposal?
Chair.
Thank you.
Chair.
Okay. Is there anything on the minutes? No.
Chair, but could I just mention 2 things?
Yeah.
I omitted the cabinet member, Councillor Andrea Lewis, from the last meeting, so she needs to be included in the list of attendees. And also, there's a typographical error in relation to citing of bus stops, so that needs to be recorded as well.
Yeah, I think that was somebody being, Peter.
No, I'm grateful for pointing it out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to welcome all officers and our cabinet member for environment. I'm sorry about the dog barking. So I'd like to go on to agenda item 4, but before I go on to item agenda 4, would the cabinet member like to open up on this management and maintenance of open space?
Yes, happy to do, Chair. I mean, the report is compiled by officers, mainly to Jeremy, Chris, and I'm sure all the guys will make a contribution into it. But just as a sort of overarching comment, I mean, obviously, we've got policies within the council that have an impact on the way we manage our green spaces, our commitment to biodiversity, for example, and climate change. They have loads of strands within them, and this is one of them. I mean, there's very little that isn't impacted or affected with what we do and deliver that isn't impacted by them. But this clearly is one of them, and it's a driver for us to look to do something now from a parks perspective, because parks manage the open space, cut most of the grass, hedges, etc. The Park Service is happy to carry out the members of the authority, the wishes of the members, and are looking for direction as a result of this being carried out by the PDC. So the service, and I'm sure Chris will comment on this, is basically happy. We cut the grass currently in line with the policies of the council and the instructions of the authority. If that changes, so from a parks perspective, happy for that to change, and happy to carry out any change to the current regime and the way we currently cut grass and maintain our green spaces. Having said that, within the report there are some advisory sections. So, for example, a common theme with people is that wildflower meadow and that all you do is leave grass grow and don't touch it. Well, that's a bit of a misconception with a lot of people. So officers are better equipped to deal with the whys and wherefores of that. Similarly, if you cut grass, if you went through a true wild meadow and true back to nature, that is important that we remove the grass, because if you just cut grass and leave it there, it goes back into feeding, and you have nitrogen-rich soil, which is not necessarily good for growing wildflowers and that. So there's a bit more technical stuff involved, and I'm sure the officers are far more better equipped to deal with that than me. But in principle, I mean, where do I stand on this? Happy again for the discussion to take place, and happy to look at reducing the amount of cutting, mowing, and general maintenance that we do now. having said that, I think another common belief is that if we stop cutting grass or reduce the cutting of grass, it'll save us money. Nowhere in this are we looking at anything to do with saving money. Okay, it's better about how we manage green open space. Some examples, we've already started doing this. I mean, I don't know if any of you have visited Singleton Park in the last year. There are swathes of areas in Singleton Park that have been left to go to meadow. I've been and seen them myself. I think they look quite attractive. But again, it's a mixed view. I mean, there will be some negative comments. There have been some negative comments about them, etc. But I think that there is an opportunity to reduce the amount of cutting and mowing and treating of surfaces that we currently carry out. I genuinely believe it is. I think, however, that where we look to reduce it, it has to be done in a managed way. Not just left alone, because what you'll have is places full of pickies and stingies and Japanese knotweed and things like that. So it needs to be done in a managed way, and it needs to be done in a cooperative way as well. So, you know, what I would like to see in an ideal world is, if we use Singleton Park as an example, that we have an agreed approach to, you know, areas that we will leave to go to wild meadow, that's understood by the public, because, you know, somebody who's ill-informed might come into Singleton Park and just think that we've left places look tatty and go unkempt, and that we fail in our job, when the reality is that's not what we do, and we are doing something to help with the biodiversity and climate emergency. So it's about explaining what we're doing and involving the public in that debate. So in an ideal world, what you want is to find a compromise whereby everybody's happy. Now, whether we ever achieve that, I doubt very much, but that's the ideal that we all aim for. I mean, we're all ward councillors, so we know the difficulties of this. Some people in your wards will want areas left to go to wild meadow, and some people in your wards will want pristine grass cut within an inch of its life. So somehow or other, I still believe that in every ward within the authority, as well as our big spaces like Singleton Park and that, I think there is a halfway house, a midway point. What that is, I think, will involve individual communities, individual councillors as well. I don't think there's a one size fits all. I don't think that there's an opportunity for us to just go out with a mandate. We're not doing this or we're not doing that. I think it will need that consultation, involvement at all levels. But I think once we explain what we're doing, rather than just leaving grass look untidy and avoid that criticism of why aren't you cutting the grass, I think there is an opportunity here for us to get that buy-in and support for doing it. But as I said, it has to be done in a constructive, managed way. And as I said, there's certainly an open door within the Cabinet Office for this approach, and there's certainly an open door within the Park Service to change the regime that we currently have. There are a few, obviously, where it's awkward or quite difficult, is particularly on some of our grass verges, because there are highways acts and that where we have to make sure we've got good vision splays and that there's a safety element to leaving that grass grow long, etc. But we're all familiar with that. At junctions, if you're pulling out, you need to maintain the grass level so that people can see fully in both directions, etc., etc. But, you know, people will understand that as well. So without further ado, Chair, I don't want to dominate the meeting, but just certainly to say that I'm happy to, you know, see the progress of the PDC make on this, and I think there is definitely an opportunity to change the way we, you know, for the good of all, the way we currently manage our grass and green spaces and verges throughout the authority.
Thank you for that, Mark. Any questions to the Cabinet member? No? We go on to the report then. I take it, Jeremy.
No,
I did. Sorry, I didn't see you there.
I was rushing to get my hand up. Yeah, Mark mentioned just now about consultation. Can you expand what consultation he was talking about, and would that be something that the PDC could recommend?
Well, yeah, I mean, I use the word consultation, engagement. You know, it's not for me to dictate the way. I mean, I'd rather that come from you, to be honest, as a PDC. Because consultation can be, you know, a really intense citywide consultation that's carried out over a statutory 12-week period, etc. I wasn't necessarily referring to that type of it, although I wouldn't exclude anything. I think where the consultation, or perhaps engagement is a better word, is it right that the authority will dictate how much grass is cut or not grass and in which way it's treated for the ward of Penclough, using my own, for example? I think it's a better approach if the ward of Penclough is involved with officers, parks, etc., and agree that this area will be left to go to Wild Meadow and that area will be left to go to Wild Meadow. Therefore, you've got the community buy-in, the community understanding. The ward members then can engage with the public, or the public can engage with the authority over that, if they, you know, whichever way that's done. I haven't got a preconceived ideas about it, but I think it has to be done. You know, there might well be overarching policies that the PDC recommends. So you could, for argument's sake, say, I think there should be a target throughout the authority to reduce the number of grass cuts across the authority. But, you know, that could be one option. And then it can be devolved down that, you know, every ward, for example, and I'm just throwing, these are not my ideas, just top of my head stuff, you know, every ward, can you look at 3 areas of grassed area that's currently treated that you want to leave, go to meadow? So not a dictatorial approach, but I think there needs to be perhaps a bit of a driver behind it to encourage that at least some areas will be left, because the opt-out otherwise could be that everybody says, I can't be bothered, or I'm not interested, or don't. So somehow or other, I think there may need to be a little bit of a drive, encouragement, not enforcement, certainly is not words we want to use, but, you know, that sort of, so maybe there needs to be, I'm just thinking out loud, and perhaps I'm shooting my mouth off a bit too much now, but if for example, when we've got our green fleet, okay, in our policy for green fleet, we have a 5% year-on-year increase in electric vehicles or green fleet over and above the standard. So is there any reason why you couldn't have a year-on-year reduction in grass cutting sort of regime, or an increase in more and more green spaces being left to go to meadow, for example? And then that is devolved down into the actual constituencies to see how that best fits. But as I said, you know, those are just suggestions, ideas to get people thinking, I suppose. But I see Chris has got his hand up now, Chair, so he may well add a bit more to it than I can.
The reason I asked that, Chair, because I thought that Mark was aiming at something specific that they were going to consult on. But thanks for that long answer, Mark.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. He started me off now, haven't he?
Yeah, I think you stole my thunder as well, Phil, because I was going to suggest, I've spoken to the cabinet member on this, and what you say over there, perhaps fetch it down, have a workshop, if the members support this, have a workshop to break down what the cabinet member was trying to say there, break it down into wards, meeting with residents, and, you know, a bit more guidelines in the report.
You're muted.
Oh, sorry, Chris, did you want to come in?
Sorry, Chair. Yeah, it's, you know, obviously maybe we're jumping slightly ahead of ourselves, but I think Mark is dead right. You know, it would be great for the PDC as part of our work, I guess, to come up with an effective method of engagement with residents and members across the authority. But we will need to continue and include the fact that we need to make sure it's a coordinated approach, so that you know, instead of having sort of areas of increased biodiversity dotted around, we need a coordination, so there's an element of continuity, so that for wildlife can travel, you know, from along green infrastructure corridors, as opposed to having little islands everywhere. And then that also, there's obviously an operational benefit of that as well, in terms of continuity of work. So I think we started probably without any of the solutions, but at quite a sticky way to implement, once the committee comes up with some recommendations as to how and what range of options you'd like to consider for alternative management practices. It's about then the coordination, how that all ties together, but ties together to make them more effective as a whole, rather than individual little bits of effectiveness.
Okay, thanks, Chris. June, you had your hand up.
I was just going to say, Chairman, can we wait till we have the officer's report? Because I may come back with questions for the cabinet member and the officers.
Peter?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, I'll have things to say about the report later when we get on to the main discussion. All I wanted to say at this stage is, first of all, to endorse what Mark was telling us in his opening remarks, particularly concerning Singleton Park. I live across the road from Singleton Park, and during the prolonged lockdown last year, it was my main source of exercise, and I can confirm that the selective cutting of the grassed areas, leaving much as natural meadowland, was extremely successful and, in my perception, extremely popular with the users of the park. And it was interesting to see dog walkers in particular making use of the cut areas through the meadowland and enjoying it thoroughly. So absolutely endorse what Mark was saying in relation to Singleton Park. And that brings on to the general point, I think, that what we're aiming at here in terms particularly of roadside verge grass cutting is culture change. Yes, there will be opposition from people who perhaps don't properly understand why we're doing it or what we're doing and to what purposes. So there is an exercise of, a massive exercise perhaps, of culture change and public understanding that will need to be undertaken. But I'm sure we all recognise that. Otherwise, Chair, I'd like to speak later on the report when we get to that point. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, we'll go on to the agenda item now. Jeremy, are you presenting it?
I think I'll present it, Chair.
Okay, Chris, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the topic of the PDC is extremely wide. Management and maintenance of open spaces, and what we sought to do with this report is to really break it down. So this is, as Mark said, one strand, and that is focusing on really areas which are predominantly maintained through grass cutting, parks, on our highway verges, and other amenity open spaces. And I'm sure the committee will want then further strands to be considered as part of the overall topic of discussion, such as going forward, how would we maintain our nature reserves, areas like Caline Valley. This is all under the wider heading, but is outside the scope of this particular strand of that heading. So the council is responsible for a large number of parks, highways and open spaces, and these have a wide variety of uses, from sort of sport, general recreation. They contribute to general well-being. Certainly on the highway verges, they have safety implications and provisions for services, but also our green spaces should also be for biodiversity and for wildlife. It's also fair to say that what the council is committed to promoting biodiversity and green infrastructure, and has taken action to the challenge of climate emergency. So in terms of the scope, this is focusing on the areas maintained through grass cutting, and what the report seeks to do is to purely identify those areas, advise the committee what we do now and how we do it, and really then seek a steer from the committee as to what areas the committee wishes us to do further research on and further engagement in colleagues in nature conservation and third sector organisations and even into the private sector, to gather options that the committee may wish to consider before it comes up with their recommendations. So the report basically splits it into two separate areas. The first being roadside verges. The reasons and the purposes of verges, they are an integral part of the highway network. They provide soft edges to highways for pedestrians to use if there's no footway available. It provides vision splays, particularly at junctions and at bends, and they do facilitate services on some occasions. At the moment, we generally cut highway verges around 9 times a year. We use ride-on mowers to do it, and the cut grass is left in situ. Around obstructions such as trees and signposts and safety barriers, they were treated with a herbicide, but we significantly reduced that, and now we periodically trim these areas. But that does result in much longer grass at these locations, and that's something which really needs to be accepted as the potential downside for reducing our herbicide use. And it's only a downside if you feel it's unattractive, and people will have their own opinion on that. On the rural verges, where there's less pedestrian movement, generally we cut these just twice a year with tractor-mounted flails. So that'll be mainly around the Gower and in Mawr. But it is has to be recognised, I'm sure that the members of the committee will recognise that Northside Verges, they do have a huge potential for increased biodiversity and to become transport corridors for wildlife. So I'm sure that the committee will be interested in looking at which areas that can be safely and aesthetically acceptably left to grow more than they are now. Moving on to other grassed areas and amenity spaces, so that's our parks and other open spaces. That can include sports pitches, school grounds, cemeteries, housing land, and any other land that the authority owns. Parks Operations maintains all of these areas in accordance with how we're asked to maintain them. And the cutting frequency varies depending on the nature of the area. There's already been a discussion around grass on Singleton, where we cut that just once a year, but cut pathways through it so people can walk through it and enjoy that, through to high profile amenity areas. Unfortunately, in 4.2 of the report, it says to cutting amenity areas 2 times a year. Sorry, that's a typo on our behalf. It is up to 14 times a year on the very high profile amenity areas. And on sports pitches, that really depends on the need, depends on when they're being used, and obviously depends on the weather. Generally, and this is a key point in terms of management through grass cutting, apart from fine turf, we leave grass lie, so we don't collect it, and generally that is not a problem. It becomes windblown. However, it does enrich the soil, as Mark alluded to earlier, and when the cut grass enriches the soil, that inhibits the growth of some natural wildflowers. So even though we have long grass in Singleton, we don't collect the grass, so it's not been managed in a way which traditionally you would call meadowland. It's more long grass which is cut once a year. So its biodiversity value is relatively limited. However, I suppose in advance of this PDC, we had an opportunity through a grant to purchase some grass collection equipment, and one of the areas that we're going to look to start with that equipment, obviously this potentially could be changed depending on the timing of the PDC's recommendations, but what we would aim to do ahead of that would be to manage those areas of long grass in Singleton and in other parks through a cut and collect system twice a year, which then would start to reduce the amount of nutrients in the soil and would encourage then more the natural wildflowers. And having spoken to Deb and Simon and Kerry, then we would consider, do we look to include a seeding element? And that could be done this year, it could be done next year, if there aren't any self-seeded natural flowers this year. So, we are fortunate to have purchased some equipment, invested in some equipment, which will allow us to gradually start trialling areas under different management regimes. And I think Peter mentioned it's been fair to say that through the pandemic, there's been a huge increase in the demand for public parks, and again for many different reasons. Some people want to walk through long grass, enjoying the biodiversity of the plant life and the animal life. Other people want to lay out a picnic blanket and have a picnic and have their kids kick a ball around. And I'm sure that the committee would take the range of views on board to seek a balanced approach, so that we have a range of management options in different areas, so that we hopefully, Mark mentioned that we would hope to please everybody. I suspect that we would look to displease everybody less than maybe we would if we don't do it the best way possible, because unfortunately with change, it's virtually impossible to please everybody. It's about striking that balance. Just very quickly in Area 5, some potential areas, and this is just a start of a 10. This is not meant to be exhaustive list at all, because we really wanted the committee to come up with where they want us to go with this project. So if you have areas which are already adjacent to hedges and woodland, reduce cutting frequencies of grass in those areas is automatically adjacent to an area of wildlife, so it would help to ensure that area is rich in both plant life and wildlife. And this is the thing about what maybe we want to avoid, is having small islands everywhere which wildlife can't get to easily. Obviously that's, the pollinators can get to them, so there's a benefit there, but it's trying to have some corridors of biodiversity if possible. Areas that contain trees, again, if people want to play football, it's a little bit difficult when you've got a heavily wooded area. So again, that might be an area where we'd want to leave the grass grow longer. Steep banks, again, that's a low meter value. So again, maybe a higher priority for looking at alternative management regimes. And I think it is one of the recommendations is that this needs to be a very much a team approach. I believe Deb's on the call from Nature Conservation, and there are a number of organisations like Plant Life, but I know Deb has told me Plant Life is one of many that we can link in with to make sure that we gain all their experience and practices that have gone elsewhere when we come up with recommendations, or you come up with recommendations as a PDC. Just to finish, I know Mark did mention a couple of points of, it is important that we understand from the start. Cutting grass less often doesn't necessarily make it cheaper, particularly if you've got to collect it, because collecting takes a long time. You have to transport it, and then you have to pay to dispose of it. But what that means is it's about the scale and where you do it, as opposed to that it can't be done. So it's just a factor we need to bear in mind. And also, apart from the two cut and collect tractors that we have just purchased through grant, a significant change in management of green areas would need new plant to do that. So even if we could do it with the same level of labour resource, there still need to be an investment. But that is nothing new to authority in lots of different areas. What we need to do is to program that change as equipment needs replacing anyway. So everything is achievable. It's about how it's rolled out to best manage financially any change. And just to raise the last point that Mark made, as a parks operations area, we are more than happy to maintain the grassed areas and parklands and open amenity areas in any way the authority wants us to. We don't have any preconceived ideas. All we need is the equipment and resources to be able to do what we're being asked to do. So I am really excited by the prospect of this PDC, and I think that it can produce significant, well-needed change, and I think it's going to be something quite significant for us going forward. So, Chair, I think that's the report in quite a large nutshell, maybe, but there you go.
Thanks, Chris, for that well-informed report. We'll go to questions now. Mike White, you had your hand up first.
Yes, thank you, Chair. A couple of points, if I could, please. In regards to Section 3 on the obviously the open space biodiversity, what really galls me is that you say about roadside grass verges. I get a lot of problems within our ward where we get irresponsible motorists that will just churn them up. And I think we really should be, as an authority and as a service, perhaps stamping down on this if we can. I know that we can't put signs on every grass verge like we got in some parks, not the park and the verges, but surely if we could make some kind of announcement or statement that any sort of offenders doing this, without that we will deal with it as an authority. Because as I say, it is so bad when you see that we've got nice maintained verges across the areas, and then next thing you see they're all troughed up and muck and being dragged all over the road and that. So that's one point. If we could perhaps look within, so we could put something forward as our PDC committee plus the service could look at, Chair. Secondly, in regards to 5.1 about the looking at the other areas, on bullet point 5 in regards to the banks and slopes, criticisms that I've received of people who live in the ward is that if the grass is so long on these banks and slopes, because they're not just cut as regularly as sort of parks and other areas and playing fields, it intends to gather litter, attract dog fouling and fly tipping, because I've had issues where people have seen an area which hadn't been cut for a while, and next thing you know, somebody has come along and dumped black bags there or rubbish, and I have received criticism of that. So perhaps that could be looked at in regards to banks and slopes. But as I say, but I really appreciate what we're trying to do with the biodiversity, to encourage for wildflowers and the nature. I really appreciate that. And in regards to the last point, which Chris talked about regarding where we're going to consult, I'd appreciate if we could perhaps bring on board our schools, because most of them have got Green Flag Award for what they do within the school grounds, and I would hope that we could perhaps include the schools so they could have their input into what we actually want to do within the park services. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Your first point, I was going to ask about that as well, about verges, talking about Town Hill Ward, only, outside Lady Lord's, nice green verges when they left alone, but you do get the irresponsible person that parks them and churns them all up. Anyway, we'll go on to the next person, is Peter Jones. You're on mute, Peter. Let's go back on. There we are.
Whew, right, I'll start again. Apologies, Chair. Too eager to get going. I welcome this report, and not least because it's an endorsement of one of the recommendations in the Natural Environment Inquiry review that received Cabinet approval back in, I think, it's the spring of 2019. It was one of the report's recommendations that roadside verges and other open grassed areas be reviewed to see to what extent the management could be undertaken differently with an eye to biodiversity and maintaining a natural setting rather than a regime necessarily of grass cutting. That was one of the fundamental recommendations in that scrutiny inquiry report, which I chaired. The other point I'd make also, of course, that the context, the legislative context, we need to bear in mind the 2016 Environment Act. There's mention made of the Wellbeing Act, but what is really driving environmental policy now in Wales is the 2016 Environment Act. And in particular, Section 6 of that Act, which provides for maintaining and enhancing biodiversity and the development and maintenance of healthy ecosystems. And that is a legislative requirement placed upon all public authorities, of course, as I'm sure officers and members recognise, including, of course, this authority. So the Natural Environment Review report and the Environment Act, I think, are important background considerations in relation to what is being proposed here. Obviously, I fully support the inquiry that is being proposed into how we manage better, in particular, roadside verges. And roadside verges are important for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons, perhaps, or two reasons, perhaps, is that passing motorists, if we have suitable wildflower planting, I hope will appreciate the value of the planting and will want to respect it, picking up on the point that Mike was making earlier about drivers parking on the verges. Hopefully they might be discouraged from doing that. But also, of course, in terms of general public well-being, that kind of environment encourages people, and there's research evidence to support this, people actually feel better if they are in a setting which encourages them to feel that they can see wildflower planting and the colours and so forth that go with that. But obviously the principal benefit of managing our verges for wild planting and leaving nature to run its course is for biodiversity. And by biodiversity here, we're talking about the planting itself and the wildflower species that we need to encourage to recover. And of course, the species that in turn depend on those wildflowers, the insects, invertebrates, bees in particular, and then in turn the species that depend on the insects, not least wild birds of some species. So there's a whole sort of structure there of ecosystem dependency that can benefit from managing our roadside verges more for wildlife and less perhaps for tidiness and neatness. I looked this morning again at the Plant Life site for their advice in relation to the management of roadside verges in particular. It was interesting to note in their report that I think they were saying that something like 70% of local authorities, councils, are interested in and have policies in place to manage the verges more for wild plants. And obviously we would want to see Swansea joining that. Well, perhaps they were in that 70%, wasn't clear who was, but I'm sure we'd want to see Swansea added to that. And the report noted that there are something like 700, astonished me, 700 wildflower species that grow in roadside verges somewhere in the UK. That's an enormous number, and clearly we really want to be part of protecting that. And that then needs to be set in the context of something like 97% of traditional meadowland having been lost in the UK since the 1930s. 97%, that's what we've lost. I can remember as a child, bluebell fields, for example, in Sussex, where I grew up, It's gone. It's gone. Got some in my back garden, but won't find them out in the parks and public places necessarily. And so the plant life is saying, cut less and cut later. And that seems to be sensible advice, picking up on Chris's point about maybe 2 cuts per year rather than the present 9 or whatever it might happen to be on particular sites. And this can only be of benefit both to biodiversity and to human well-being and health. But if we're going to consult plant life, we should also, I suggest, also consult bug life. Bug life who are responsible for, in particular, I mean, they're an invertebrate conservation trust. They look after insects, bugs, etc., bees and so forth. And clearly bug life, therefore, in a sense, work hand in glove, if you like, with plant life in terms of their biodiversity responsibilities. And that then brings me on to my final group, RSPB, of which, as I mentioned at the outset, I am a member and former employee of. And of course, birds depend on insects. Birds, therefore, are an important part of the ecosystem that we're trying to construct by a more natural management of our grassed areas. So those 3 public organisations, Plant Life, Bug Life, RSPB, and there are no doubt others as well that might be interested in providing advice, and I suggest we consult with all of them in relation to this. I think this is an excellent way forward. I'm glad that the Council is thinking about doing it. I'm sure the PDC, I hope, will want to endorse what is being proposed. I mean, looking at section 5.1, areas for consideration for the review, I would endorse all 5 of those. I think they all need to be given priority. They're all worth doing. And that out of this exercise, and I've only talked about roadside verges, of course, but we can also include green areas, parkland and the like. I would hope that out of this exercise will come a movement towards the recovery of biodiversity across Swansea, with benefit to biodiversity and to all of us. So congratulations to the officers for preparing this report, and I look forward to progress in seeing it carried forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Peter. Got one more hand up, and then I can ask the officers to come back on any questions. June?
Thank you, Chairman. Number of points. When we're looking at the planting of wildlife, in Penderry Ward, people are going to be using wildflower turf. Do you think that would be of benefit to the authority rather than have to dig up every year, plant the seeds, etc.? That's the first point. 2, when we're talking about the grass verges, I know a number of you will have seen Cockett Road, where a number of houses have got together and taken over the verges and planted them. Is this something we should encourage? I'm not saying the odd house, because that would interrupt the cutting of the grass verge. But if we can get rows of houses to get together and take over the verges, like we've got companies taking over or sponsoring our roundabouts, if that can be done. And finally, I support the pilot of purchasing the cut and collect vehicles. Hope we'll have an update report on that. It won't be obviously till next year when we see if it has benefited the authority. I know it is more expensive, but if it can encourage further growth of the wildflowers, that would be great. And the other thing, I have a lot of compliments from people outside of Swansea who say our grass verges are a delight.
Thank you, June. Before I ask Chris to answer any questions, Rob, you've got your hand up. Robert Francis Davis.
Yeah, apologies for coming in late, and I missed Mark Thomas's introduction because I was on a previous meeting. Well, when we are consulting, we need, other than just plant life and bug life and the RSPB, you know, there's people that put us here, there's the people that elect us.
and that's where we should be consulting with as well. In fact, I think they should be uppermost in our minds, those people. I had quite a few letters, emails coming in about the grass being allowed to grow in Singleton. I must admit, cynical me, I thought it was an orchestrated campaign to send emails in, because they all seem to appear in the same week or the same fortnight, and I'm always suspicious when we get a lot of emails in being complimentary. But I did also get complaints as well from people who like to see their parkland sort of manicured. So it's about getting that balance right within our parks, I believe. Also, health and well-being, participation in sport is needed, and we got to make sure that we maintain access for people playing. And I had a few complaints, and sometimes trees were planted too close into an area where people play football. I had some 14-year-olds approach me and saying, my father was saying that when they played football, they would go and find a green area, take their jumpers off or coats down and put them down as the goal mouths. But there's not many places we can go to play football anymore, because either the grass is too long, or it's too expensive to take permits out in parks, or they're ushered off out of schools. There's been a lot of development, and just being able to get people to participate in sport is not as easy as perhaps it was when I was young. And we got to get that balance right, that we get people participating in sport, and that when we plant trees, and I welcome the addition of trees in our parks, but we got to make sure that they don't interfere with the participation in sport. As you know, football pitches running alongside each other, quite often in between there's a cricket wicket, and then the football pitches or rugby pitches are used as outfield for the cricket as well. So it's getting that maximum use of our parks. I get lots of compliments about places like the Enterprise Zone, which is, when I go back to my youth, it was a moonscape. It was just ashes, it was the copper slag, nothing would grow there. There wasn't a tree on Kilway Hill. Now we got a huge forest going up the Swansea Valley, a green lung. I can remember the Director of Environmental Health in Swansea saying that anybody going yachting on or going on the Fenrod Lake, if they fell in, they probably were doomed, they're going to die. Just quite funny, really, because some years later, he was a Commodore captain. He was actually teaching people to sail on it. But the same person, Eddie Ramsden. But it's great to see the amount of wildlife that is on the Fenrod Lake. But a lot of people use it for pleasant walks, and a lot of people who are employed there just use it to be able to go out in a break time or lunchtime, just to go and have a lie in the grass and enjoy it for green open space. But they do like to see that manicured grass. And I take the point that Councillor Mike White said about some of the embankments down alongside the River Tower, where the cycle paths have been put along from Beaufort Road, down the river corridor, down past the Mover. We seem to put in cycle paths, but we don't seem to maintain them after, or maintain them and know the reasons why. That's not a criticism of the department. That's lack of maintenance budgets, or the cuts that have been made over 12 years in the austerity budgets. But it does encourage people just to go along, and in fact, they like Christmas trees. Some of there where the dog bags have just been hung up on trees and left right away along there. And the bank's then overgrown all the way down. And people are throwing litter down in there. But there's also the central reservations. I had complaints, people, when Nathan Talbot with a highways maintenance saying it was marvellous how they would cut the central reservations until you come into Swansea, and it looked unkempt and not attractive. Some people will think it's attractive having long grass, other people not. But it's important how we look after our central reservations, how we maintain them, because and what we pick to put on the central reservations. When it comes to litter picking, it's very difficult along by Sainsbury's there, because you've got bushes there which have got lots of thorns in, very difficult for the wind-strewn litter to be picked. And we've got to close down lanes just to get access to it. And I'm sure some of our staff must get their arms ripped to pieces with the thorny bushes. But it's also caused a fatality as well of people crossing those, because people can't be seen coming from those central reservations. So public safety is important. And when you go along Fabian Way, although it's now in Neatham, but it's Neatham but all, but Swansea University though, we got to make sure that people can be seen crossing those roads, because they are busy. And I know there's controlled crossings there, but students being students don't always go along to the controlled crossing areas. It is about getting that balance right, making sure we push forward our biodiversity pledges and our commitment to it, but also looking at parks are there for people to enjoy, to take recreation in. And the last time I was in Singleton Park, to me, it just looked a mess, and it wasn't. And I think we need to actually talk to people of what they want to see. It's not what I think is right. It's not what Councillor Peter Jones thinks is right, or Councillor Mike White thinks is right. It's the people we represent. We've got to take on board their views to ensure that we are providing parks and maintaining our parks and open spaces and our central reservations for what the majority of people want. And I would agree with Councillor Mike White about churning up our, and especially in Town Hill there. And I think up in Town Hill there, most of them are being cut up by people attending the local club opposite the church that you mentioned, Chairman. And they seem to be contractors that we use for traffic lights, because they always seem to be parked outside that club there on the grass verges or on the mud churned up verges. But I did have lots of compliments on the wildflower planting, but again, it's got to be controlled. The last time we put wildflowers in Morriston, I think they've been overplanted. There's not enough nutrients in the ground for them, and so this year we haven't ordered any this year because they weren't successful. But when I look at the Broadway as well, there was no grass reseeded around there. There was lots of little daffodils, but they were the miniature tater-tates. I think dandelions are probably as attractive as the little daffodils that have been planted around the Broadway section, to be honest, because they are so small, just interspersed between the mud. So it's getting that balance right, and that's how we consult with people. And when I look at the places like the Fen Rod, lots of people work in there. I think it's important we talk to those people that work and live in these areas and see what they want as well.
Thank you, Rob. I do totally agree with you. Although Bug Life and the other stakeholders, the residents of the individual wards should have a say in what they want. I notice I've got two more hands up. Deb, you wants to come in?
Sorry, unless Councillor Lewis would like to go first. I just wanted to add a few more points, but shall I go now, or shall I allow Councillor Lewis to go first with her question?
I'll go back to Wendy Lewis then. Wendy?
I wasn't going to speak, but just listening to everybody, and there's nobody likes flowers more than me. We pay a tremendous amount out of our budget every year to put wildflowers, to put we've planted trees, as Deb knows. Myself personally, I disagree with the curbside left to grow, because I have tremendous amount of complaints about. I've had one complaint for cutting it, but dozens for not cutting. My thing is about somebody said here, I can't remember who it was now, people walking across the grass verges, and if they're high, obviously they're going to get wet if it's rained when there's no crossing point. My take on that is dog's mess. If you stood in that or child fell in it, you can't see it because the grass is so tall. That's unacceptable to me as a ward councillor. I love seeing the wildflowers. We've got more in Wenaloedd than anywhere else in our ward, and they're everywhere. We've had daffodils, they look tremendous. They absolutely do. But we have in Wenaloedd as well got a place in the park that's not cut, which is, but then that gets very messy because there are not good plants in there that are growing, and then it makes it look worse. So I think the same as everybody else, there needs to be a balance. There needs to be more care taken of the places that you leave in wildlife and wildflowers, not wild plants, I would say, not flowers, grow. Because if you've got thistles growing up there and it looks terrible, I think the whole place looks terrible. But we are doing our bit in our ward, and I am all for biodiversity and everything else that goes with it. But I think we really have to look at it carefully and, as you say, get the residents. But I know what people would say in my ward. Okay, thank you, Wendy. Deb?
Yeah, just to say, obviously we welcome this report. We work with Chris and Jeremy and his team to support the management of our open spaces for biodiversity, and I think this report to increase the number of pollinator species on areas of land that are currently mown as amenity grassland and other areas is a really big step forward. We have a pollinator action plan for Swansea. We've got a biodiversity plan. Welsh Government are really keen to support these initiatives with funding. And, we have already kind of pledged to work with Chris and his team to identify those sites that maybe are the most, priority for starting some of this work. So maybe, like has already been said, areas that are on steep ground, or maybe are wetter areas that, we're currently mowing that cost quite a lot of money and we don't really need to be mowing them, and looking at the concept of linking up corridors of wildflower meadows, which obviously have greater impact for pollinator species. But the stepping stones as well, they're really important. And just to pick up on a couple of points that were raised, the turf that Kate McCabe and the Penderry Penderry group are looking at. I think parks have done some fantastic stuff with the annual flowers, but we need to look also at perennial mixes, and so both planting perennials either through plug plants or turf or seeding, but also just by mowing, just by changing the mowing, there are seed mixes in the ground there already that will come back as soon as you start reducing the nutrient content. Those species will just magically reappear. And so I think maybe I mentioned to Chris about just helping to identify some priority sites where we can get the maximum return for the minimum amount of effort. And just June, I know exactly what you mean in Cocket. That I've taken photographs. It's absolutely wonderful, where they planted wildflowers outside their house on the verge, and cars don't park on it. I think the power of flowers is not to be underestimated.
Okay. Thank you, Deb. I've got another two hands back up. Is that Jeremy? Before Jeremy comes back in, June, you have another question?
Yeah, this is what Deb said about plants regenerating. What plants are we using that every year out of our community budget we're having to pay for seeds? If they are regenerating, why don't we leave that area and go to a different one?
Deb, if you'd like to come back in, to just answer that question.
Yeah, and perhaps Chris as well. But I think you know, I think the annual mixes, those really fantastic, colourful displays that everyone is really, really valued and appreciated are fantastic. But, you know, perhaps we need to look as well at more perennial mixes so that we don't have to reseed every year, that they will just naturally seed themselves and come back.
Okay, thank you. I know there's a lot of questions asked there, and Chris haven't got back. But Jeremy, you wants to come in? Is that to help Chris out?
I was just going to, thank you, Chair. I was just going to very briefly cover the comments regarding encouraging householders to take over verges. There are a number of considerations that need to be taken into account here. I agree with the positivity and how it looks, but there are, unfortunately, with all schemes, elements of downside. We need to engage with our highways departments around the legalities of that and around planning, etc. in these areas. And also it's around protecting, should those householders move on, who's then left with reinstating or then managing those areas. So while I don't disagree with it to be looked at as an option, there are some other matters that we need to consider before we would encourage that.
Okay, thank you, Jer. Chris, you come back in. You've got the task of answering all these questions, mate, and you're on mute.
If I could run through some of those points, Chair. I think the verge has been churned up. I suppose to a certain extent it is more of a highways issue than a biodiversity issue, but obviously there is a strong link there, and I understand why Mike's picked it up. And generally it would be kind of each site on its merits, and I think that yeah, if it was planted, or even if the grass was left to grow longer, that would deter some people from parking on it. If the residents themselves are parking on it, some interaction with them on how it's maintained would help to deter them parking on it. But then if you've got, I don't know, visitors to a school parking on it, there'd be less of a deterrent. So I think that we'd need to work with highway colleagues to look at, I suppose to a certain extent, use some of the biodiversity tools as part of a solution, but verges being churned up is an issue itself, and it's a highway issue really. But I'm happy to pass on potential biodiversity options to Bob Fenwick to look at those. Yeah, I think members have, you know, they've raised the pros and cons of this, which as a committee I'm sure you will need to wrestle with before you come forward with recommendations. I think the long grass, it can gather litter, but it needs to be litter picked. It's a little bit more difficult then, I think Robert mentioned about thorns, which kind of traps litter as opposed to gather it and makes it really difficult to pull out. But long grass can be litter picked as well as short grass. Bringing on board schools, I think the schools, both in terms of getting the children involved, but schools have a lot of grounds that could be used to encourage this, and they are in a more secure to external influences. I'm sure as members you'll all have paid to plant trees which have got ripped up. School grounds often then become a school project, and it becomes both a biodiversity benefit, a sort of benefit for insects and invertebrate, and it becomes an educational benefit as well. So we really would ideally want to bring schools on board in the whole project to use their land as well. So I think it's a cracking one. I think the bug life as well as plant life and the RSPB, I think we do need to gain the knowledge and experience of all these organisations, but ultimately as a public body, it's we would need to engage with residents and bring on board their views, but ultimately as members, I suppose Cabinet and Council ultimately need to make decisions, which sometimes a statutory requirement conflicts with what residents, the majority of residents, would prefer. So that's why I'd rather be an officer than a member, I suppose, where you've got those difficult decisions to make. So I think the engagement is a really good point. It's a difficult point, but ultimately decisions have to be made. I think with the wild turf, it's something we can explore, June. I think it's, again, these are like the wild wildflower turf, the wildflowers we planted so far, the annuals, are different, I think, to creating a meadowland, a natural meadowland. And it is true, it might be confusing for some, but I think what Robert was saying, you plant wildflowers that we have been doing for 3 years, it pulls the nutrients out of the soil, and they're quite nutrient hungry, so they don't flower well. But then the opposite is true for the natural wildflowers in the meadowland, is where it's the leaving the grass in the ground which stops them growing because there's too many nutrients. So, and I think that they are different tools and they each have their place. And I think June was quite right. June was saying about moving them around. I think that because we have, and even on the annuals, there are some areas where we haven't reseeded them because there was concern there wouldn't be a great showing. And there has still been some self-seeding of those areas, some poppies in particular. It's not as vibrant, but at least then we haven't had to spray it, we haven't had to treat it, and nobody's had to pay to seed it. So they're all kind of different tools, really. And I think a lot of people love short grass, a lot of people love long grass, and it's about having the short grass where, as a council, we believe that it best fits for purposes of sport, recreation, and having long grass in where we think that best fits. And that's where I talk about balance, a balanced approach. And maybe what we can do with Deb's team and Simon and Kerry is look at our areas and kind of work out where, and we can bring back some examples. Maybe we can take a relatively, a small area of the authority and come forward with some suggested areas for where we would leave the management of grass as it is now, where we might change it significantly, and to see what you think then. And then that sort of approach, if that approach is welcomed by members, it could be rolled out then. But as I was saying, this is I think this is a topic which is going to need to be rolled out in a controlled manner. And I think Wendy's point about it is a real conundrum, isn't it? I think everybody is concerned about climate change. Everybody likes sort of wildflowers, but it's everything in its place. And I think even with highway verges, I've seen some of the plant life case studies, and even they then, if you've got a wide verge, they would still potentially mow an edge to it and keep that short, but leave a good width long, so you have that good balance. So if people are on the highway, they can step off the highway onto short grass if they need to, if a car's coming along, or even if we've got people we know cross a verge, it is part of the highway. There may be, if it's wide enough, that it might be appropriate for some long grass, but maybe we'd need to cut strips through it for people to be able to walk across it. But one thing that I suppose we need to bear in mind, everything has to be operationally manageable and affordable. So if we have lots of thin verges, which we are asked by council to leave grow long, cut twice, and collect that grass, that's going to be very expensive. And if the council is prepared to pay for it, then that's fine. I've got no issue with it. I suppose as officers, all we will do is to give the consequences, potential consequences, the pros and cons of different things, and then members will decide. And I think the other thing that Wendy said, which struck me, was the comment about thistles. Probably some people love thistles, but I think what's important is we're really talking about a different management regime. We're not talking about abandoning areas, because if we abandon areas, we end up with, maybe dominant plants which maybe nobody wants. Your brambles and your ferns, which can be not potentially biodiverse rich. It's about it. So we need to look at it and think about it in an alternative management regime as opposed to abandonment, I guess. Unless there are large areas where members decide leave it, go back to nature, but we'd need to look at the surrounding land, look at what's there, so that members would understand what abandonment would potentially look like. So hopefully I've covered most of those points, Chair. If there are any that I've missed, I'm happy to pick up any further points. if they're technical, I'd have to pass on to Kerry and Simon because I'm certainly no expert. But yeah, so if there are any points I've missed, I'm happy to pick them up.
Okay, thanks, Chris, for answering all them questions. I see no answers. Only one hand up, and I think it's Debil.
If I could just a couple of things, basically supporting what Chris has said, and I think, you know, the more nutrient rich the soil, the more likelihood you have to get those kind of rank competitive plants coming through, like thistles and ragworts and God knows, you know, other things which, you know, maybe we're not so keen on. But I would just I just wanted to say that you know, totally endorse the whole idea that in the same way that when we're looking at tree planting, it's like the right tree in the right place. We need to think of the wildflowers as the right flower in the right place, and there is a bit of work to be done, you know, technical assessment and sifting of sites to look at where are the best, you know, where are the best potential benefits for doing this work. And also to just say, I know I've spoken to Chris, you know, the comms side of it is really important, raising awareness and explaining to people why it's beneficial. And we are looking at, we're producing some signage for the Mumbles to Margam Pollinator corridor that we're working on at the moment. And, you know, I think the more people understand why you're doing it, you know, take on board everything else that's been said, you know, about the other uses of open spaces and the need to consult. But a lot of the time, you know, when you explain to people why, then they, you know, they're less likely to object to the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Deb. Any more questions to officers? No? I'd like to thank Chris and all his staff for the hard work gone into this report. Chris, well done on you. I take up on all members' concerns and your concerns. I'm wondering if we should set up a workshop to look. All these concerns have been recorded anyway. I'm wondering if we should set up a workshop to look in with not just members, some of your officers, Kerry or whoever, that could sit down with us and we can go through them and see if we can come back with good answers. Yep, okay. The recommendation then is for the item 4 is it is confirmed that the scope, there's 3 recommendations, sorry. It's confirmed that the scope of the review is confined initially to the maintenance of the grass areas. Secondly, the parks operations and nature conservation teams liaise with plant life and other relevant organisations in the review of the council's green space maintenance. And finally, third, that a further report will be brought back to the PDC in due course, setting out the proposed future policy context prior to seeking approval by Cabinet. Can we pass them recommendations, members?
Yeah.
Show of hands.
Yeah, happy to move that, Chair.
Okay. Again, I'd like to thank Chris and all the team. Oh, June, could you hand up? Sorry.
No, what you said about a workshop, would it be worth considering an online survey to find out what the public would like? I'm sure we can come up with some questions to ask them and we can work on from that.
I haven't got a problem with that, June. If the members, Rob, you got your hand up.
Yeah, well, I would endorse what June is saying, but I would also ask that when we're looking at the parks, if from the culture team, the recreation officers could be involved to ensure that what is going on doesn't affect the effective use of sport and recreation within our parks.
Okay, I'm happy to go along with that. Okay, if you offer,
because the thing is getting it all coordinated to make sure that everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet and they're all signed up to everything that's going on.
Okay, Rob.
Yeah.
Phil?
Chair, I think the only thing that worries me listening to everybody is about the grass verges, because everybody is going to be parochial about grass verges. So how are we going to tackle them? Because, like, I didn't want to mention, in my ward, there's a number of grass verges, and different people have got different ideas. So I don't know. It's a big one, that is. So I don't know. We're going to tackle that one. Over to you, Chris.
Yeah. Just a suggestion. I suppose that we also talk about a set of principles. So you might say, if you have a grass verge which is less than a metre wide in an area of, or in an urban area with an adjacent footway, then it should be kept short. I'm not saying this is the recommendation, but it could be kept short. If a grass verge is 3 metres wide at the back of a footway, then that could be let to grow long with a 1 metre strip cut on it. And if there was a series of principles members agreed to, it would maybe then would be easier than talking about specifics initially, because then if a 3 metre verge is in one ward, it should be treated the same way as the 3 metre verge in the same circumstances in a different ward. And if you've signed up to the principle of it as a member, then that then maybe would be a governing factor as to that would apply across the board in that circumstance. It's a one way to deal with it, because otherwise, once we need to look at every circumstance on its own, I think it'd be quite difficult, I suspect, to look at each verge and have an individual's view on it and policy driven by individual views on individual locations, because that's not a policy.
Okay, thank you. Peter?
Thank you, Chair. Just quickly, I like the idea of having a working group. I mean, and I know that approach is also already working very well with another PDC, and I think that the topic under discussion justifies a similar approach. In terms of wider public consultation, which of course I fully endorse, I hope people weren't misrepresenting me and suggesting that I was only interested in approaching NGOs and that I excluded the public. Of course not. But in terms of approaching the public, I would expect and hope that members of this PDC would have prior sight of the proposed questions that are to be put to the wider public to ensure that they are appropriate and balanced and so forth. And my only concern, and I am an environmentalist, I don't mind it, I glory in that title if you like, people need to be reminded there is a biodiversity crisis, and that what we're trying to do has to be set in the context of that biodiversity crisis. It's all very well people having short-term considerations about tidiness, but the fact of the matter is we've got to do more for biodiversity and wildlife. And that may be unpopular with some people, but in my view, and in the wider view of people who look at these issues, it's got to be done. So I hope that we can have full consultation within this work, within this PDC about that consultation before it goes out. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I'm sure Jeremy is taking note of that. Jeremy, you want to come in?
Yeah, very briefly. I'm very conscious of the time. I just wanted also to follow on with Councillor Downing's comments and concerns, regarding the verge issue. And I think it's important also to point out that who we're going to be consulting with at the start in relation to plant life, for example. There are many other authorities and organisations that have moved somewhat ahead, are already well on the journey into resolving this and will have already come across these issues and problems, and we can gain a lot of advice and support from those organisations, which is the principal reason really for engaging with them, and then hopefully guide us in the principles that Chris mentions so that we can come up with a policy. And that's then supported by a really strong education plan. So where these pieces of work undertake is that we seek to be able to publicise to the public why we're doing what we're doing and why an area, say for example, is left uncut or why it is cut. And I'm not suggesting that we have masses of signage everywhere, but the engagement with the community after we've consulted to identify and publicise what we're doing apparently has been the key success in a number of areas where this has already been undertaken. So that's already being considered. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Deb?
Following on from that, I'll just say absolutely you support what Jeremy said, and there are a number of counties in Wales that are doing really good work on this, and we could invite them to come and talk to us about it if that felt to be appropriate. But yeah, there's a lot of excellent pioneering work going on already, which we can learn from rather than starting from reinventing the wheel.
Okay, thank you. No more questions? Okay, thanks Chris for attending this afternoon, and again thank you for the well written report. Can we go on to item number 5? Sam? Environment, Economy, Infrastructure, PDC work plan.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Obviously, today is our last meeting for this municipal year. The council diary will be considered at annual council on the 20th of May, but I can confirm, I'm looking at the diary that will be going to that the scheduled date for our next meeting is the 17th of June.
17th of June, okie dokie.
So the work plan at the moment, we've got a couple of things that do need to come back into committee for the next municipal year. And of course, we need to have a think about our annual report as well, which I believe Martin Nichols has had a conversation with you about. So at the moment, everything's been captured at the bottom of the work plan and will be brought forward for members to consider in the June meeting, in our first meeting.
Okay. Any members? Oh, Martin, want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just to follow on that. So, given that we've tended to do a look back on what's been achieved during the course of this municipal year, as well as then setting the forward work programme for the next municipal year, that tends to be quite a lengthy session in itself. So, if members are agreeable, I'd be happy for us to present a report to that session in June, outlining the annual report, but also then perhaps suggesting some indicative dates for the items that are listed. I think we've captured everything that we've discussed at the committee previously, but if there are any further items that members would like to consider in next year's work programme, obviously they can mention them now or before or at the session that we have in June. But as you know, it's been quite fluid during the year and items have been added and taken away, but there are a number that you've already penciled in to conclude, including the one that you've discussed today. So we'll start with the ones that you've agreed and then add to that work programme as appropriate. But main theme would be cover that off in the June session as part of that single report. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Matt. Okay.
The other thing, Chair, on the annual report, things may crop up that we think we haven't finished in the last year. So I think that's when the annual report would capture that.
Right, Joe. Okay.
Cyril.
Yes, who's speaking?
Sorry, Cyril. I'd just like to say that I know you've taken the bus stops off now, but it was agreed they'd go on. And I'm not really comfortable with it being taken off and not discussed.
Is that an oversight?
It's not now.
It's still on.
It's still on there.
On page 2.
On page 2. That's good. It just confused me then. Yeah, it's on page 2. Pen.
Sorry.
It's on page 2 of the page 13. Sorry.
At the end, it says that the the director has said to take it off because it goes under transport. And the reason that we brought it up was because some of us had concerns about the sightings of these things, whether they'd been moved intentionally or whether it had been done as an oversight or in conjunction with the authority, needs to be looked at, because if there's an accident, and the one I'm going to mention is the one that you and I have spoken about, Cyril, at the top of Conway Road, that's on a roundabout. If there's an accident, the first thing people are going to do is come back and say, well, the authority have allowed it, and they'd be quite right. So I think we need to look at this, irrespective of who says what, and it needs to be discussed in full.
Pen, can I just ask you where are you reading that from? Because I can't see it. I
just read it. I'm going between. Sorry, sir. I'm going between two computers here because my other laptop's not working, and I'm trying to see it on my blooming phone.
Yeah, because it's on page 2. Yes, go on, Sam.
I beg your pardon. I'm sorry to interrupt. I think maybe Councillor Matthews is referring to the minutes of the last meeting, the work plan item, that's where right. The Director of Police referred to. He said he'd come back with an update because he thought that it was to do with the Ministry of Transport, but I think he may have an update for you.
Yes, it was with the commissioners. But that's right. That's the point, isn't it? That's the point I'm making.
I think Mr. Nichols has an update for committee members on that issue.
I can't get into anything on you. See, I've had terrible trouble all the week, so I apologise if I missed something. But
Chair, may I come in? I can perhaps help clarify. Yeah. So as discussed in the previous meeting, I did follow it up as requested by members. The council does have a role in determining the siting of bus stops. So Councillor Matthews is correct. Happy to include it in the work programme. I was only suggesting that if the council had no role in it, it perhaps wouldn't be appropriate for it to be picked up here, but that isn't the case. Apologies if I inadvertently provided that incorrect information previously. So happy to include in the work programme. I'm happy for members to determine which priority where you would like to see it in the prioritised programme, but we will include in that June report as an item to come into the committee for the coming municipal year. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Okay, Pen, confused me then because it is on the work plan. Any more questions for anyone? Okie dokie. Thanks for everybody attending, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Chair.
Cheers, Matt.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.